Hello, welcome back, brothers and sisters. So today, how do we file grievances on the new equitability provisions in the 2023-2026 National Agreement? As you probably know by now, there's two new lists called the NSD list and the RSD list. Now, the NSD list, letter carriers can sign up and come into work on their day off only, up to 8 hours of overtime only. Every other day, they are treated as if they were not on any list. No overtime list, meaning 8 hours a day only, but with the possibility to be ordered in on their SDO to work up to a maximum of 8 hours of overtime. So, a new option. Then we have what's called the RSD list, regularly scheduled day list. What is this? The RSD list, you're signing up to be available to work up to 12 hours per day only on your regularly scheduled days. So that would be a maximum of 60 hours per week if it's 12 hours per day, 5 days per week. And management cannot bring you in on your regularly scheduled day outside of mandating you as they would have before in accordance with Article 8.5D. So there's two new lists there. The 12-hour list is then eliminated. There is no more 12-hour any assignment list, but the two components can be signed up for simultaneously. So you can be on both the RSD list and the NSD list, and that, in essence, would put you back into the status of the 12-hour any assignment list, where you can work up to 12 hours per day, up to 7 days per week, of course, with the maximum limits outside of the month of December of 60 hours per week, except that now, with the new national agreement, you can volunteer to work over 12 hours per day and 60 hours per week, and the Postal Service will automatically compensate you the additional 50% without the need of a grievance being filed. And that is being done. It's a Z on your pay stub. So Z, that is what the pay is now categorized under. So we have these new lists, the elimination of the old list. We still have the work assignment list. That has not changed at all. So that is exactly the same. On your own assignment only, up to 12 hours per day, up to 60 hours per week. And you're not signing up to be ordered in on your days off. And then, of course, people that are on zero overtime, they're not on any list, actually. Although some offices create a list just to say who is on the no overtime at all list, which is a maximum of 8 hours per day. And of course, the limitations placed on management under Article 8.5F, which, yes, they are limitations, even though the Postal Service doesn't understand all of a sudden what a limitation is. But that's a video for a different day. So now, how do you process equitability with these new lists? Because remember, there's no more 10-hour any assignment, no more 12-hour any assignment. There's just the RSD list and the NSD list, and the ability to be on both at the same time, which, like I mentioned before, would put you back into the status similar to the 12-hour or 10-hour any assignment list. Well, you're going to have some extra steps now because you have to separate out the RSD overtime from the NSD overtime. So you're going to create basically two lists. Instead of one list tracking all overtime, you now have to track the RSD overtime and the NSD overtime. Even if the carrier is on both lists, you still must look at their total daily hours and track the RSD, or the regularly scheduled day overtime, and the NSD. What else is interesting or unique about tracking the overtime? When you have a letter carrier that is on both the RSD list and the NSD list, and they come into work on their regularly scheduled day, no problem. If they work 10.5 hours, 2.5 of those hours would go on the RSD list. 12 hours, 4 hours would go on the RSD list, and so on. But what about when they come in on their day off? When they come in on their day off, you're going to track their overtime on the NSD list up to 8 hours. But what if they work over 8 hours? What happens then? Well, then you take the amount of overtime they have worked over 8, and you're going to track it on the RSD list. So here's an example of that. As you can see, I use the overtime alert report, and I put a B for both. For RSD daily and NSD if they are only on the NSD list. And as you can see, I separate out the overtime for RSD and NSD for each carrier every single day. Once you get their total overtime for RSD, and I mean total for the quarter. For example, the quarter that just ended January 1st through March 31st. Let's say you would take this carrier here and you would total up every week their RSD total. I write it there, as you can see, next to their name. And then at the end of the quarter, I add up all of the weeks. Then you would track their NSD total. As you can see, I total that per week. And then I add all those weeks up and come up with their NSD total if they are on both lists. If they are just on RSD, then I just total RSD. If they're just on NSD, then I just total NSD, and so on. Now, you can find an average just like you did before. You're going to find two averages. You're going to find the RSD average, and you're going to find the NSD average. How do you do that? Well, this other video I've already made about equitability is exactly the same. Nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed is the tracking of the hours and the lists and the categories, but the methodology remains the same. So just as before, you would find the average, you would make a list of letter carriers that were below the RSD average and letter carriers that are below the NSD average. Nothing else has changed, such as if they took their name off prior to the end of the quarter, they wouldn't be included on the grievance. And so if they were 204Bs not performing bargaining unit overtime, they wouldn't be included on the grievance. So those things are all exactly the same. You would follow the same methodology as before. But now, you would still have to allocate the hours from the high RSD carriers to the low RSD carriers, and from the high NSD carriers to the low NSD carriers. The RSD works exactly the same like before. You just take a high carrier. If those 2 hours they worked, a low carrier had an 8-hour day that same day, and they should have been made equitable and brought their average up while the high carrier's average was brought down. But now on the NSD, there's some interesting anomalies there. Why? Because Article 8 has not changed in the language that you can only order somebody in for 8 hours of work. You can't order them in for 6, 7.5, or anything like that. So the NSD then, when you're allocating from high to low carriers, you have to count those opportunities in 8-hour increments. You can only take 8 hours at a time from the high carrier, and you can only give it to the low carrier at 8 hours at a time. So if the average was 40, for example, and you have a high carrier that's at 42, you couldn't take 8 hours from him. You couldn't take 2 hours, because you can't give it to a letter carrier that wasn't ordered in unless it's at least an 8-hour increment. Remember, these this allocation can only go to letter carriers that were not brought in at all. So there has to be at least 8 hours of work. So it's carrier to carrier, in other words. And if the carrier ended up only working for some reason 7.5 hours, I still allocate those 7.5 hours to the carrier that should have been brought in. Why not? If the carrier decided to go home early, well, that has no bearing anymore on the equitability on NSD. And so I would allocate those 7.5 hours to a carrier that didn't come in at all, but is also on the NSD list and is at least 8 hours below the average. See? So now they have to be at least 8 hours because those chunks, those allocations are in 8 hour, theoretically in 8 hour chunks. And also the deduction of that high carrier is also in a limited 8 hour chunk. So you couldn't take 8 hours from them and make them be below the average. Then that person, even though they look like they're 6 and perhaps they are 6 and 7 hours above the average. You can't touch them. You can't take that overtime and allocate it to a low carrier anymore, because then that would bring the high carrier below the average, or vice versa. If the low carrier was less than 8 hours below the NSD average, you couldn't allocate to him anymore, unless in that limited circumstance where an ODL ended up working 7 hours for some reason, got paid for only 7, and this person is 7 hours under. So you have to look at that as well. I have included a link for sample contentions in the comments. Thank you guys so much for your attention, for continuing to learn, and for continuing to make life better for letter carriers. Until next time.